change one letter.
There's a lot of bad things in monsters, but you guys ready?
Yep. Alright, all of you guys are grandmas.
Really? I just did it in my room?
No. You have to stay.
Call of Duty.
Alright, so as we get back in, the next thing we're going to be covering is the Bible. Is the Bible reliable? Again, we want to look at things outside of the scriptures to evaluate, is it true, is it trustworthy, is it reliable? And then we also want to look at what is the scholarly community saying about this. What are the things that are most agreed upon universally that we can say, hey, this is a fact, we know this is a fact because it's universally agreed upon, whether they're Christian, atheist, doesn't matter. It's a fact based off of history. So that's going to be the things that we're looking at. We're going to cover 4 topics, possibly 6, if time is going good. Archaeology, extra-biblical support, medical evidence, resurrection, early claims of divinity. Bonus 2, hopefully, is going to be the manuscript evidence and the Isaiah scrolls that were found before, about 500 years, or dated about 500 years before Christ, and were on little tiny silver scrolls that we can actually, we know about. So if we can, we'll dive into that too, if time allows. Before we start, I do want to, again, we're going to go back to what does the Bible tell us? So I can get 3 people to read. We got Isaiah 40, verse 8.
The grass withers, the flowers fade, but the word of our God will stand forever.
Okay. 1 Peter 1:25.
But the word of the Lord remains forever.
And then Hebrews 13:8.
Jesus is the same yesterday and today and forever.
So, again, from the Christian perspective, we want to use godly wisdom, and we're going to use the foundation of what he says is true. But we want to evaluate how can we explain this in a way that other people will accept, understand, and be willing to listen to, because we're not turning to this first. We will turn to it. It just doesn't need to be the first thing that we turn to. And so as we look at it, the first thing we want to touch on is archaeology. One, does anyone understand the archeological method? Basically, how they find stuff, how they date stuff, anything like that? Does anybody know anything about that? Can anybody guess what it's rooted in? Okay. The methods, what is it rooted in? No, close.
Is it like finding one thing that they're sure about and then basing everything else off of it?
Christian principles. It's based off of Christian ethics. It was based off of looking for, wait, let's use the Bible as a roadmap and let's go find this stuff because we know this is a historical document. And then the way they tested it to make sure was they went to the Bible and they matched it. And they were able to match what was going on with Scripture. So the methods they use today still are rooted in Christian ethics, Christian perspective, and showing that the Bible is true. That is how archaeology is done. It was rooted in, and it's still done today, the methods. It was all rooted in Christian principles and Christian ideas. You cannot separate Christianity from the world around us. It is permeated through so many fields. Science, even our Constitution, our laws, our ethics here in America. It is all rooted and founded in Christian principles. This nation was founded on Christian principles. There's no separating Christianity from the world around us. It's woven into our fabric, whether we know it or not. So, first thing we're going to look at is the Tell-Dan steel. Does anybody know what that is? Not you. You run things for people.
Skills are
What was the
like
question
stones
again?
where they recorded like important events in history or documents.
Yes. What were you going to say?
What was the question again?
Do you know what the Tell-Dan steel is? So she explained what it is, in the sense of what a steel is. But does anybody know what the Tell-Dan steel is? Because
It was found on the Tell-Dan.
Well, it was an Aramaic tablet that showed that there were 2 kingdoms in that period. I think that one used, I think it even mentioned the names Israel and Judah.
it did. So, the Tell-Dan steel was a steel discovered at Tell-Dan, she's correct. A steel is essentially, or a tell is essentially a giant mound of dirt that has a city under it. That's basically what Tell is. So Tell, big old mound of dirt they dig into for archaeology, and then Dan is the place. So Tell, Dan, and then Steel is what they found. Tell, Dan, Steel is essentially a trophy. Think of it like a trophy from the time of David. And so what was on it was the house of David, and it had the name of Judah, and it had the name of, you just said it too. Israel. So it had the two separate kingdoms, and it showed the conquest of a foreign king, I believe from Armenia. Anyways, it had the name of a foreign king conquering Judah, talking about the house of David. So what can we know from that? That existed, just based off of evidence. What can we know existed based off of that?
House of David.
House of David, and what else? Two kingdoms. So we know that the Bible is reliable in the telling of the fact there was two different kingdoms, so that Israel was split, and we know that it talks about the house of David, and that it was conquered. So the house of David was conquered because it was a trophy. So they conquered Israel. Next thing we're going to look at is going to be the ossuaries. Does anyone know what an ossuary is? Books.
Yeah, bone box from the time of Jesus.
From the first century. So a bone box essentially is a little limestone box they would carve out. And then once your body decomposed enough, they took all your bones, stuck it in there, and put it in the wall so they could put the next person back decompose. So it's a bone box. So we have two different bone boxes that are very significant. One being that of Caiaphas and one being that of James. Who's Caiaphas? Who's James? Okay. So based off of that, who do we know existed?
Caiaphas, he's talking about the Bible.
Right. And what did Caiaphas do?
He was the one who was
The high priest.
the high priest when Jesus was in trial.
Right. And so what did he do?
Sent Jesus to Pilate.
He was the one who pushed or condemned him for blasphemy and took him to be executed. So we know Caiaphas existed. We know James existed, being the brother of Jesus. We know that Caiaphas was the one who was responsible for taking Christ before Pilate to be executed. And guess what else we found in the Caiaphas ossuary? Crucifixion nails. So we know that these two things, we know that the Bible is reliable in the sense it talks about Caiaphas, it talks about the execution, it talks about James, and then we see in the bone box 3 crucifixion nails. Isn't that interesting? Next thing we're going to talk about is 2 different tombs. Very, very significant tombs in the Bible. What do you think they would be? Okay, Jesus, and then who else? Lazarus. Who is Lazarus? Again, going back to scripture, who's Lazarus? Okay, and what did he do? What did Jesus do with Lazarus? How long after he was dead? Several days. 3, 4, I don't remember. Several days. Yep, shortest verse in the Bible. He stinketh. Okay, so we know that Jesus rose Lazarus from the dead after several days. Long enough for the cultural time for the person to be considered dead. Okay? So the person was actually dead then, is essentially what that meant. They're dead, so now we can raise them from the dead. That's what Jesus did. Guess what we still have today that has never been lost for over 2,000 years that you can go visit? His tomb. And we know it's his tomb because for the last 2,000 years, it has been venerated and it has been kept as a sacred place to commemorate what Christ did there. We've never lost it. It's been in our possession for 2,000 years. Same thing with the tomb of Christ. Does anybody know where it's at? Beyond just the generalized location. Don't just say it's It is in a church. Does anybody know give me a guess at the name of the church.
Whoa.
So the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Does anybody know what sepulchre means?
Tomb.
A church of the Holy Tomb. You guys got it. Okay. So I might just kind of read from that because some of these are not off the top of my head. Okay. So does anybody know who Emperor Hadrian is? What?
You're like, oh, sorry.
I'm like,
Hadrian, when he conquered Israel, what's one of the first things you do if you want to establish control in an area?
Set up your own authority.
Right, and in the first century, what is the best way to do that?
Use the local ones, but make them loyal to you.
Take away their places of worship. For centuries, we saw Christians communing at a tomb, and then we see Emperor Hadrian come in, conquer the area, and build a temple directly on top of that area, covering the tomb. So we knew where the tomb was. It was covered. Constantine came in, and what was Constantine famous for? What did he do for us? First Christian emperor. How did he become? How did Christianity become legal? Because it's an interesting topic.
Edict of Milan, and Constantine was fighting to become emperor, had risen, and believed it was from Christ.
Right.
Himself to be a Christian, and then made it legal.
So how did that happen? Because was he the sole emperor to make that happen?
No, because the empire was split. But
Correct. So we accredit Constantine for making Christianity legal, but he couldn't do it alone. It required his co-emperor to make Christianity legal. It was not just him. But when Constantine became emperor, and when he was the one in power, what was one of the first things that he went and did?
didn't he give the church in Rome a palace to be a church?
Maybe. But if we're talking about the tomb of Christ, what is one of the first things he did? We know that Emperor Hadrian came in, built a giant temple on top of it to a foreign god, covered over the tomb. What was the first thing Constantine did as a Christian emperor?
Take down the temple.
He went and tore down the old temple. He went, tore down the temple, had them dig, because essentially the way they did that is you have the tomb, which was cut into the hill. They built up a platform to cover the tomb. And so in order to find it, you had to literally dig through the floor of the new palace, or the palace that was there, the temple that was there. They had to dig through the floor and dig down to find the tomb. And the first thing that Constantine did is he commissioned that to be done. So they tore down the old temple, they went and then basically uncovered the tomb, built a church directly on top of it, and what is the name of that church again? The Church of the Holy Sepulchre that's still there today, that we've had since 300 BC, since the time of Constantine. And we can trace it back directly to the early Christians around 33 AD. So we have Lazarus' tomb, we have, what's it called?
Jesus' tomb?
Yeah, there you go. We have Lazarus' tomb and Jesus' tomb. We have the ossuaries. We have the archaeological support from the things like Tel Dan steel. We also have pottery that talks about Goliath, right? Biblical Goliath. So we have all these archaeological things that are just proving over and over that the Bible characters that were talked about from Genesis to Revelations are real people who lived, walked, and died, right? And so we can show that. The other thing we can show, just again, we're going to do some bonus information. Manuscript evidence, since we're here. What is that? Does anybody know? Let's talk about that. Let's dive into it real quick.
From the body of old manuscripts, like the total collection, how much they agree with each other, and how close they are to the time of their original writing.
Yep. And how much of that do we have now? Okay, give me a number.
Like, way more than any other book. It's 5.
There's a 5, but 5,000 is a little low. Anybody else? Give me a guess. Come on. 50,000? It's a little high.
15,000.
Roughly about 24,000 copies. It's about 24,000. I think it was like 24,597 manuscript pieces that we have today. There are fragments, whole copies, and that's from Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, Latin, Coptic, and Greek. I think I said Greek. But it's from a wide, vast array of languages. The bulk of them being Latin, 10,000 from Latin, about 5,487 from Greek, and the rest varying from Latin, or from Coptic, and Aramaic. So, we have a lot of manuscript evidence. Why is that important?
So that we can rewrite the Bible even if we have no Bible.
Yeah.
It tells us the words that we're interacting with are the same as what we're originally written.
What's the next closest near ancient text that we have? How many? Homer's Iliad. How many do we have?
Not really that many. Like 600.
547. I believe it was the last time I checked. 547. And how far does it date within the time of Homer? Like
1,000 years.
1,000 years. So we have the text dating 1,000 years after the death of Homer, and that is the next closest near ancient document we have. What is the closest document we have within the Christian text dating to Christ's death?
15 years. 15 years.
20.
That we can prove. We ought to shadow it out. Within 20 years of Christ's death, we have documents popping up. And then according to the oral tradition, we can trace some of them back to 2 years of Christ's death. First, specifically 1 Corinthians 15. That is universally agreed upon by every secular scholar, every major scholar, whether it be Christian, secular, doesn't matter. 1 Corinthians 15 is the oldest of all Christian traditions. It dates to within 2 to 5 years based off the oral tradition, and within 20 years of Christ's death based off of a written document. And what does it tell us? What does 1 Corinthians 15 tell us? It's very important. It is the
Died, according to the scriptures, he was buried, and that he was again, according to the scriptures.
What else does it tell us? It's very, very important.
He appeared to 200,
500.
500. So what it says is he lived, he died according to scriptures. He rose again on the third day. That he is God incarnate, right? It tells us that he appeared to the 500, to the 12, to Peter, or to Paul, and to James. That's what it tells us.
Paul says himself too, so that's pretty cool.
Yes, he said Paul and James.
I missed that, I'm sorry. I heard Peter.
Oh, I said Paul. Wrong P name. So it was technically the 11 because James wasn't.
Yeah, but Judas knows.
Yeah,
He
It's
didn't
another-
have none of a third person do this.
it's another topic. So 1 Corinthians 15 tells us that he appeared 500 to the 11 to Paul and then lastly to James, right? And it's universally agreed upon as the oldest of all Christian creeds, and it is dated to within 2 years of Christ's death based off the oral and 20 years based off the written. Nothing else compares. Literally nothing else. If we were to take every Bible, every text that we have today, there is no document in all of human history that even comes close to the text we have on Christ. Bar none. So we know the text they had 2,000 years ago and what they believed 2,000 years ago is the same things we teach today based off of conservative Christianity. It's without a doubt. So archaeology supports it. The text evidence supports it. And then we're going to look at extra-biblical support. So when we look at extra-biblical support, there's a few people we want to look at. There's going to be 5. First is Papias. Second is Irenaeus. Third is going to be Josephus, or Tacitus, Josephus. And the last person is Bart Ehrman. Anybody know who that is? Bart Ehrman's a more modern-day person. Give me a guess at who he is. Huh? No.
He's
Say it again.
he's an opponent.
Yeah, he's an antagonist to Christianity. What did you say?
I just said secular Roman historian.
Not Roman. He's American.
Well,
So he is an atheist who's formally trained in theology, textual criticism, and he is not a proponent of Christianity. But he is a formally trained theologian, historian, and textual critic.
You should everybody start to this list.
is
Look him up.
Okay.
Really, really good historian.
so are the first 3 of that list then Christians and the second 2 not?
So the way this breaks down is you have Papias and Irenaeus, who are both first-century authors. Tacitus, who was also a first-century author, but he was a historian for the Romans and an antagonist to the Christian faith. In other words, he had no dog in the fight. He was just reporting it as he saw it. In fact, he didn't like Christians. Josephus, he's kind of more of a debated source, but he's more debated. But he's also a Roman historian. Last person, Bar Ehrman, again, complete. He has no dog in the fight. He does not agree with it, so he is only going to tell you what he believes to be true based off of reason. He's not fighting for this. He's not saying this is true because I believe it. He's saying it's true because this is what the evidence shows. Okay. So first person is Papias. Papias was writing in roughly 125 AD. He was writing roughly in 125 AD, and he records how carefully Matthew and Mark, Luke, and John recorded their Gospels. They were very meticulous in what they did. It was not an accident. It wasn't done without thought. The Gospels are a recorded history. It is something we can look to as a historical document, right? And that's what Papias is telling us in 125 AD. And Irenaeus comes in 180 AD and confirms the authorship of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So we know Matthew wrote Matthew, Luke wrote Luke, Mark wrote Mark, and John wrote John. We know who wrote it. We know they recorded it accurately. We know they were meticulous. That's what they were writing in the first century, 125 and 180. That's what they were writing. Next, we're looking at Tacitus. Actually, I have a quote for Tacitus. So, Tacitus, again, what is he? Is he for Christianity or against it? He's against it. He doesn't like it. What is he? What is his job, though? He's a historian. Yeah, he's a reporter. He's a historian. All he does is report what's happening for the Roman Empire. This is what Tacitus has to say about the life of Christ. He says, Christius, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our proctors, Pontius Pilate. They did not use the word crucifixion because it was so grotesque. It was to be so far removed from a Roman's mind because of how horrendous it was. There's a reason why it was illegal for a Roman to be crucified. That was reserved for either traitors to the kingdom or people that were not Roman. That was not a punishment that was for Roman citizens. It was so far removed from everyday life for Romans. So they didn't use crucifixion. They used extreme punishment or extreme penalty. That's what we see Tacitus does. Josephus has the longest excerpt about Christ in the first century. And he says, about this time where there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed ought one to call him a man, for he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accepted the truth gladly. He went over many Jews and many Greeks. He was the Christ. And when upon the accusation of the principal men among him, Pilate had condemned him to the cross. So we know that he was dead. We know he was crucified based with Tacitus and also off of Josephus. And then if we go to a more current author, Bar Ehrman, he confirms this. Again, is Bar Ehrman for or against Christianity?
Yes.
Against. So he has no benefit for confirming anything, right? And he says this. One of those certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on the orders of the Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. We know Christ died by Roman crucifixion at the hands of Pilate. It's a historical fact. There's no disputing it. That's what the extra-biblical sources tell us. It's indisputable. He was dead. That's just a fact. And then if we look even further, that's what the medical evidence tells us. So we know what the history tells us, but let's just be able to say, what does the medical evidence tell us? And there's a couple points we want to look at. First thing is going to be pericardial and pleural effusion. Next thing is going to be hypovolemic shock. And then JAMA. Does anybody know what JAMA is? Journal of the American Medical Association. In the 1980s, they wrote on the death of Christ. And so, first thing is hypovolemic shock. Does anybody know what that is? Give me some information. Let's talk about that. What is hypovolemic shock?
Isn't that the blood loss?
Yeah.
You lose so much blood that you go
You lose so much blood, your cognitive functions fade, and you have a hard time standing up, breathing, you become very, very thirsty. So when we look at the life of Christ and his death, what are we seeing? Do we see any signs of hypovolemic shock after the flogging? Because most people didn't even survive the flogging. The flogging was so extreme, it would lay intestines on the floor, it would give way to stomach walls, it would lay veins bare, people didn't look human anymore. So most people died from the flogging alone, let alone getting to the cross. In fact, the cross is where we get the term excruciating. It literally means out of the cross because of how intense the pain was of crucifixion. That is what that term originates from. So when we look at hypovolemic shock, what do we see in Scripture that would tell us that was happening? Okay, what else? Yes. So he couldn't carry his own cross, and who had to carry it for him? Simon of Cyrene. And then when he was on the cross, he said, I am thirsty. And what did they give him? Vinegar. So those two things point to hypovolemic shock, which often occurred based off of the flogging, and many didn't survive that, let alone the crucifixion. So when we move to the next thing, it is going to be pericardial and pleural effusion. Does anybody know what that is? It happens as a result of hypovolemic shock.
To do with your heart, pericardial portion of it.
Yep, and pleural would be what? Okay, what? There you go. So pericardial and pleural effusion has to do with heart and lungs. So what is that? What does that mean? Give me your guess. Give me a good guess.
Isn't it like it's blood pools something so much that your heart can't pump? Something like that?
Yes.
Remind me what pleural effusion is?
Lungs.
Lungs.
Okay. What it is essentially, your red blood cells in your plasma begin to split. Fluid begins to build up around the heart and lung sacs, clear fluid. And when they thrust the spear through the side, what came out? And from the first century, we're going to say blood and water, but in modern day medicine, we're going to say pericardial and pleural effusion. Blood and water separated and came out. It meant he was dead. Without a shadow of a doubt. That's it. When they speared them, they weren't killing them, they were confirming death. Right? If they wanted someone to die faster, they broke the legs. If they were confirming death, they stabbed them in the side because blood and water were flooded. So it was a confirmation, not a cause. Does that make sense? The last thing we're going to look at is going to be what JAMA has to say. JAMA being the Journal of American Medical Association. They're a pretty reliable source, don't you think? Okay. Modern medical interpretation of the historical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead when taken down from the cross. It's a fact. Jesus died by crucifixion. He was dead. There's no denying that fact. Okay? It is a historical fact. He was dead. Last thing we're going to look at is the resurrection claims. What would tell us it's true that he was risen again? Right? Because people don't come back from the dead. It's kind of a fact. You die, you're dead. It's just a thing. Right? Everybody dies. It's the one thing about life. Everybody's guaranteed. You're going to die. So how do we know that the dead man is now alive? How do we confirm that? Give me some answers. Okay, eyewitness. But, okay, again, so people make up stories.
Multiple who hold to it consistently over time and under pain of death and torture.
Yeah, and hundreds of people who didn't interact with each other who confirmed the same story when they told their story, none of it ever contradicted.
Well, I have one point I want to ask you guys. My dad likes to argue with me about it, but he's not here. He can just shh. Okay. We know the name of the man who stabbed Christ in the side. He's just called the centurion in the scripture, but we know his name. Does anybody know what happened after that, after Christ died? What happened with his life? What did he do with his life?
Someone said, truly this man is the Son of God.
Okay. That's what he said, but what did he spend the rest of his life doing? What's the central message of Christianity? That Christ what? He rose from the dead. Central message of Christianity, he rose from the dead. So what did the man who killed him spend the rest of his life doing? Following the message that the man he killed was alive again and back from the dead. He became a Christian. And beyond that, we have the women being the first people who were the ones who saw the empty tomb. If we're trying to make up a story in the first century, the one thing you do not say is the women were the first people to find it because they were not considered legal. They could not give legal testimony. It's embarrassing to if you're trying to make something up, that's an embarrassing detail you would not say. Right? So we know they're giving just faithful accounts of what's happening. Because the first thing they say is the women found him, not us. What's the other thing we can say? In the first century, was anybody saying the tomb had a body? Right. Nobody in the first century was saying there was a body. It was self-admitted in the first century there was no body.
I was just saying, including the historians, Josephus references the claim of the empty tomb in some of his other writings.
Yes, he does. I don't use a lot of Josephus just because he's a little bit more contested than
It's a lot more contested.
I know.
But even the historians against it make reference to the empty tomb element without arguing that there was a body in the tomb. Is all it was.
Yeah. So we know the tomb was empty. They shot themselves in the foot by saying, hey, the disciples stole the body, because what did they just admit? That there was no body. And the people don't die for known lies. It's just a fact. If you're lying and somebody puts a gun to your head and says, tell me the truth, are you going to die for that lie if you know it's a lie? No. Them being willing to die excruciating, horrible deaths, at the very least, tells us that their faith was genuine, that they believed the man that they followed for his life that died was alive again. So we know their faith was genuine and they didn't make it up. So when we put those two pieces of information, the people who were against him said the disciples stole the body, yet the people who were proclaiming were willing to die for the claim he rose again. Those two things don't add up, and the only thing that really reconciles them is that he actually did. So when we start, again, we want to look at apologetics from the perspective that we're building a case like a rope. We're weaving together a rope. We're not just trying to say it's true because I think it. We're trying to say when we compile all the information, what's the most intelligent answer that is beyond a reasonable doubt true. We can't prove anything true. Philosophy teaches us one thing. We can doubt anything. Can you doubt it? Can you make it beyond a reasonable doubt? We should doubt stuff. The Bible tells us to question everything. It doesn't say we should follow things blindly. We are told to question things. The question is, can you show it reliable beyond a reasonable doubt? And that's what we're trying to do. And so when we start compiling the evidence, the manuscript evidence, the ossuaries, the tombs, the medical evidence, the fact that the tomb was empty, the fact that the Pharisees admitted it, these people were willing to die a horrible death for a sincere belief that man was risen again. The only thing that is going to make sense of all this information is that man actually was seen risen again. So just from an intellectual perspective, based off of what we've covered so far, we know that we need a creator based off of cosmology, based off of microbiology. We know that history shows us, extra-biblical evidence shows us, archaeology, just an evaluation of the facts shows us that the tomb was found empty. The people that were claiming he was risen again were willing to die for it, and they were willing to die extreme deaths. And the only thing that makes sense of all that information is that the God of heaven became man, lived a life, proclaimed to be God, died, rose again, and showed he was God. And that's what the Bible tells us. And when we start compiling this information, that's what we're trying to show. Any questions or anything we want to talk about before we kind of take another break, and then we'll come back for the last part? No, 3, 2, 1. Cool, break. Let's take a break. We'll come back for the last part here in about 5 minutes.